This is my second go at recording this video now that I have a proper microphone set up, so hopefully audio will be better. We'll see. Before I get into this, I do want to say this story will involve a brief discussion of the untimely demise and passing of a small child, and there's also going to be a lot of pronunciations, mostly French, that I'm not entirely sure I'm going to get correct, so I do apologize for that. With that said, let's get into it. In 1848, a skeleton was exhumed from the cemetery of Sainte Marguerite in Paris, identified and reburied. In 1894, the same skeleton was exhumed and examined again, their identity in question. During the same time period, a small human heart, preserved and stored in a crystal urn, was on a journey, passing from hand to hand and surviving riots and 2 world wars before returning to Paris. Anthropological and DNA analysis would be used on the heart, the skeleton from Sainte Marguerite, and another set of human remains from the Netherlands in order to answer the same question. Are these the remains of a king of France? The king in question was born Louis Charles, Duke of Normandy, on March 27, 1785. He was the 3rd child of King Louis XVI and Queen Marie-Antoinette, so if you know your French history, you know exactly where this is going. Louis Charles became the heir to the French throne when his older brother, Louis Joseph, died from tuberculosis in 1789. The French Revolution broke out later that year. I'm not going to go and discuss the revolution in detail, but at the end of the video, I'm going to recommend a book if you would like some more historical background. Eventually, though, things became so chaotic for the royal family that they tried to flee from France. After this escape attempt failed, they were imprisoned in a fortress known as the Temple in 1792. The temple's name actually comes from its builders, the Knights Templar. It wasn't a place of worship, as far as I'm aware. By this time, the family imprisoned in the temple consisted of King Louis XVI, Marie-Antoinette, Louis Charles, his older sister Marie-Therese, and the king's sister Elizabeth. Louis Charles was only 7 years old when King Louis XVI was executed on January 21st of 1793. Multiple countries then recognized Louis Charles as the new King of France, including England, Austria, Portugal, the United States. French aristocrats and members of the clergy also recognized him as king, and he would be referred to as Louis XVII. I'm going to continue calling him Louis Charles for the sake of clarity. We're going to have another King Louis later. On July 3rd of 1793, Louis Charles was separated from his mother, Marie-Antoinette, so that he could be kept in a more secure room within the temple. Marie-Antoinette was executed on October 16th, 1793. She left her 2 children in the care of their aunt, Princess Elizabeth, but Elizabeth would also be sent to the guillotine. Louis Charles and Marie-Therese were not told about what had happened to either their mother or their aunt. In 1794, Louis Charles was moved to solitary confinement. The conditions in which he lived were unsanitary, he was treated horribly by the people in charge of his care, and he was likely malnourished, so it's really not surprising that he became very ill. On May 6th of 1795, Dr. Pierre-Joseph Dessau was appointed to examine Louis Charles. Dr. Dessau was the head surgeon at a local hospital. He was horrified by Louis Charles's condition. He reported swellings in the little boy's knees and wrists, for which he prescribed lotions that probably didn't help. That is not medical advice at all. Unfortunately, it was clear to Dessau that Louis Charles was dying. However, Dessau died soon, very soon, after visiting his patient. He and 2 of his assistants died so quickly after he visited Louis Charles, people suspected they'd all been poisoned. Then the new head surgeon, Dr. Philippe Jean Pelletan, was then appointed to give Louis Charles medical attention. So Dr. Pelletan examined his patient on June 6th. Like his predecessor, he was very alarmed by the child's condition. Although he did try to have Louis Charles move to a larger room, this was too little too late. Louis Charles died on June 8th of 1795. Dr. Pelletan was in charge of the autopsy, which lasted 5 hours. That sounds exhausting. And although other people did assist Pelletan with the autopsy, Pelletan did most of the work himself and then wrote the report. So, what did he determine to have been the cause of death? This might get a little gross, just a heads up. Based on the evidence for chronic infection in the decedent's joints and the tubercles or abnormal lesions in some of the internal organs, Peloton determined that this individual had died from tuberculosis, a disease I will probably never, ever stop writing about. Peloton's report doesn't verify the identity of the decedent as being Louis Charles. Basically, he doesn't state straight up, with absolute certainty, that this body was Louis Charles. He was being cautious, but his belief that this body really did belong to Louis Charles prompted him to do something very, very sneaky. When the other guys who were helping with the autopsy, when they weren't looking, Peloton removed the corpse's heart, wrapped it in a handkerchief, and slipped it into his pocket. For royalty at this time, this actually wasn't that weird. The slipping it into the pocket part, that's the weird part. So there was a tradition of removing internal organs from a royal corpse and embalming them, especially amongst French royalty, for a very long time. So hearts and other organs might be interred separately, somewhere else, separate from the rest of the individual's body. This was also practiced by Marie-Antoinette's family, the Habsburgs, and you can actually see urns containing some of the organs of early Habsburgs in the catacombs under Stephan's Dome in Vienna, if you're comfortable being around a lot of skeletons. I've done this tour. I thought it was great. If you're interested in learning some more about this practice and the historical and cultural background that surrounds it, Caitlin Doty made a really great video about it. I also recently came across a study of the preserved heart of Richard the Lionheart, King of England, so let me know if you would be interested in seeing a video about that if I can get access to the article. That's a problem sometimes. So why would Peloton remove the heart from this body? Despite the careful phrasing that he wrote in regards to the child's identity, he believed that the child really was Louis Charles. Peloton hoped to be able to give the heart to surviving members of the royal family, but he wasn't really in a position to return the rest of the child's remains to them. Louis Charles's closest living relative, his sister Marie-Therese, wasn't told about his death and wasn't asked to identify the body. She wouldn't be informed of the deaths of multiple family members until late June of 1795. With the autopsy complete, the child's remains were buried in the cemetery of St. Marguerite. People who had been on duty at the temple were ordered to sign a declaration confirming that this individual was Louis Charles, although most of the prison's guards hadn't actually seen him. The death certificate for the individual uses the name Louis Charles Capet and lists the names of the prince's parents. Real quick, just although we refer to his family as the House of Bourbon, the House of Bourbon is actually a branch of the House of Capet that had ruled France in the past. The channel Useful Charts can explain this in a much better way than I can. The announcement of Louis Charles' death was greeted with some suspicion. With all of the secrecy surrounding the death and the burial and various rumors swirling around about the prince, people had to wonder, was the body buried in St. Marguerite Cemetery really that of Louis Charles? Or did it belong to a substitute child? When Louis Charles was imprisoned in the temple, very few people saw him, especially after he was separated from his mother. This led to a bunch of rumors that he'd escaped from prison and another child had taken his place to act as a substitute for the prince. Some of these rumors were like, yeah, Louis Charles, he's just hiding in another country. The uncertainty surrounding the prince's fate set the stage for people to come forward and claim to be him. Multiple people claimed to be Louis Charles or Louis XVII, King of France, including at least 5 people in America. For some reason, Mark Twain actually makes fun of this in The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. 27 of these pretenders sent letters to Marie-Therese, but she actually never met any of them. The first pretender appeared in the French countryside in 1796, only a year after Louis Charles was supposed to have died. He gained a pretty big following until 1799, when his father showed up and said, "Hey, that is not a prince, that's my son who ran away from home," and took him back home to Normandy. That same year, a book titled The Cemetery of the Madeleine by Jean-Joseph Renou Warin was published. That's not even his full name. His full name has more hyphens. This book was a fictionalized account of Louis Charles escaping from the temple. In the story, Louis Charles is smuggled out of the temple in a laundry basket and is replaced by a substitute child, who is later poisoned. The most notorious pretender, though, was a Prussian clockmaker named Karl Wilhelm Naundorf, who appeared in Berlin in 1809. He claimed to have forgotten how to speak French, and he got the prince's name wrong, referring to himself as Charles Louis instead of Louis Charles. This prompted another pretender, the Baron de Richemont, to make a really sassy, savage comment along the lines of, "You could have at least gotten the name right." In 1824, Naundorf was put on trial for forging money and then spent 3 years in prison. He made it to Paris in 1833, and former servants of the royal family recognized him as Louis Charles. Naundorf was eventually kicked out of France and died in Delft in the Netherlands on August 10th, 1845. His death certificate identifies him as Louis XVII of France. So now we have two individuals buried using the same name, Naundorf, and the child from the temple whose heart Dr. Pelletan removed. While Naundorf and other claimants were popping up in various places throughout Europe and beyond, the surviving members of the Bourbon family did not forget about Louis Charles. His sister Marie-Therese was released from the temple in December of 1795. In 1814, after Napoleon's exile to Elba, the first exile, France's monarchy was restored, and a brother of Louis XVI took the throne as Louis XVIII. Alright, let's stop for a minute and just make a little inventory of all of our various kings named Louis here, just for a minute to visualize what we have going on here. Okay, we're going to start with Louis XVI. Okay, of course, so we have Louis XVI, executed during the French Revolution, married to Marie-Antoinette, and their son, the main character of our story, Louis Charles, or when he was acknowledged as king, Louis XVII. So then, once the monarchy was restored in France after Napoleon's first exile to Elba, they bring in the brother of Louis XVI, who I believe was called Louis Stanislaus before he became king. So, he takes the throne as King Louis XVIII. And this essentially makes sure that the numbering system for French kings does acknowledge Louis Charles. You know, they didn't forget about him or anything. So, that's what we have there for all of our French kings named Louis in this story. King Louis XVIII ordered the exhumation of the remains of Louis XVI and Marie-Antoinette and had them reburied in the royal crypt of Saint Denis in Paris. He also held a funeral service for Louis Charles. However, Louis XVIII still had some unanswered questions regarding his nephew's fate, so in 1814 he ordered an inquiry into Louis Charles's death. The inquiry was briefly interrupted, so here's a little history speedrun. Somehow, Napoleon returned, the royal family fled Paris, Waterloo happened, and then the monarchy was restored again. With King Louis XVIII back on the throne, the inquiry into Louis Charles's death continued in February of 1816. As part of the inquiry, the wife of the gravedigger who had buried the coffin supposedly containing Louis Charles's remains requested an audience with the king. She explained that her husband had confessed to having moved that coffin within the cemetery of St. Marguerite. This, along with reports or rumors of some other coffin-moving shenanigans, meant that by this point, there were at least 3 possible burial sites for this coffin just within the one cemetery. It was announced that an exhumation would take place on June 12, 1816, but then it was cancelled when new testimony was brought forward indicating the existence of a 4th possible burial site outside of St. Marguerite. Did the inquiry involve excavating any of these potential burial sites? No. Ultimately, the inquiry ended. It reached the conclusion that Louis Charles had died in the temple on June 8, 1795. But with no physical body, there was no proof that he'd actually died. Or was there? The inquiry didn't include one pretty important person, Dr. Pelletan, who still had the heart he'd preserved from that autopsy in 1795. He kept the heart in his desk drawer for a while until his assistant stole it. After this assistant died from tuberculosis, his widow returned the heart to Dr. Pelletan. Pelletan then tried to complete his quest of returning the heart to the royal family, but King Louis XVIII declined. When interviewed by the police, Pelletan admitted to having stolen the heart during the autopsy. He even met with Marie-Therese and told her everything, but she didn't take the heart and they never spoke again. In May of 1828, Pelletan gave the heart to the Archbishop of Paris. He then died a few months later. In 1830, riots broke out in Paris, during which people looted the Archbishop's palace. The heart had been placed in a crystal urn and tucked away in the palace's library. And a printer who worked at the palace knew that it was important, so he wanted to go save it. Though the urn had been destroyed, the printer had the documents Dr. Pelletan had written for the Archbishop, explaining what the urn contained. The printer then managed to track down Pelletan's son, Philippe Gabriel. Once the rioting had died down, the two of them returned to the palace and found the heart completely intact. Philippe Gabriel put the heart in a new urn and locked it away. While Philippe Gabriel and later a relative kept the heart safe, others were investigating the cemetery of St. Marguerite in multiple attempts to locate and identify the remains of Louis Charles. The priest in charge of the cemetery exhumed a juvenile skeleton in 1846. The skeleton did show some possible skeletal indicators of tuberculosis, the cause of death as recorded in that autopsy report. I'm not going to go into detail about the changes tuberculosis can make to human bones and how we study that in the archaeological record. It gets pretty complicated, and I plan on making a video about all of that later. But based on the swelling in Louis Charles's joints that his doctors observed, later investigators would likely be looking for evidence of bone destruction and remodeling in the skeleton's joints. This examination, though, didn't exactly have the most conclusive results. Based on the length of the bones, the doctor who examined them estimated that this individual was too old to be Louis Charles at the time of their death. One of the ways that we estimate age in juvenile skeletal remains is by looking at how much they've fused, how much development of different bones has been completed. We can do this because bones fuse along a pretty predictable timeline as an individual gets older. But once fusion has completed in adults, we have to use different methods for age estimation. We can go into more detail about estimating an individual's age with skeletal remains another time, so please let me know if you would like to see a video about that. Despite the doctor's estimation of this individual's age at the time of their death, this skeleton was identified as Louis Charles and reburied in St. Marguerite. This, however, did not put an end to any of the speculation. So in 1894, a lawyer received permission to carry out a new investigation in the St. Marguerite Cemetery. This investigation focused on the same gravesite as the previous exhumation, but more specialized doctors were involved this time. On June 5th, 1894, they exhumed the skeleton that had been identified as Louis Charles. The methods used for the analysis of skeletal remains had improved by this time. So what did the doctors observe and conclude? First, they needed to determine whether or not all the bones that had been exhumed came from the same individual. A lot of bodies had been buried in this cemetery, to the point that back in 1804, the mayor of Paris complained about there being way too many bodies in this one cemetery. A lot of these bodies came from local hospitals, and their need to bury cadavers had been dissected for medical research, and St. Marguerite is noted as having been a burial site during the Revolution. The bones of this skeleton displayed the same discoloration, the same amounts of ossification, the fancy word for bone formation, and the same measurements of the limb bones. Based on those observations, the doctors concluded that all of these bones came from the same individual. What about the individual's age at death? The issue that we saw in the previous examination of the skeleton. This time, the doctors looked at the individual's teeth to examine age. Teeth develop on a predictable schedule during childhood. which means that we can look at which deciduous, or like your baby teeth, have fallen out, and then which permanent teeth have erupted to replace them to estimate age. This individual didn't have any baby teeth left, and their wisdom teeth had erupted. Combining this amount of tooth development with their calculations of the individual's height and their observations of some other developments on the skull, the doctors concluded that this individual was at least 14 years old at the time of death. This couldn't be Louis Charles. He was only 10 years old. If this skeleton wasn't Louis Charles, could this be a substitute who switched places with him in the temple, allowing Louis Charles to escape? To answer that, we need to revisit Dr. Peloton's autopsy report, where he described the saw marks that he made in the skull. From what I understand in autopsies, they'll cut off this part of the skull in order to remove the brain. Peloton wrote that he'd made the saw marks level with the eyebrows, so out here. The skeleton exhumed from St. Marguerite had cut marks in their skull placed much higher up on the forehead, close to where a hairline might be. Thus, this individual couldn't support the story of a substitute child because it wasn't the same individual Peloton had autopsied in 1795. Further excavations of the cemetery in the 1970s also failed to locate any skeletal remains that match Peloton's autopsy report. So, we've ruled out one possible Louis Charles. We still have Karl Wilhelm Naundorff, buried under the prince's name in the Netherlands, and that preserved heart that, at this point, is still being passed from person to person. Dr. Peloton's son, Philippe Gabriel, died in 1879, and a relative of his wife inherited the heart. That relative gave the heart to Don Carlos de Bourbon, Duke of Madrid, in 1895. The Duke placed the heart in the chapel of Chateau de Frosdorf in Austria, where it actually joined items that had belonged to Louis Charles' sister, Marie-Therese. The heart stayed there until World War II, when the Duke's descendants rescued it. In 1975, the Duke's granddaughter gave the heart to the Duc de Beaufort, who was in charge of the memorial at Saint-Denis. The heart would then rest alongside the remains of Louis Charles' parents and other French sovereigns until advances in DNA sequencing and analysis could be used to explore whether or not it had really belonged to a king of France. Before the supposed heart of Louis Charles made it back to Paris, the remains of Karl Wilhelm Naundorff underwent their first round of scientific testing. In 1950, his coffin in the Netherlands was opened, and his humerus, one of his arm bones, this one, was removed, and so was a lock of his hair. It wasn't possible to test his DNA at this point. The tests carried out with these samples were exploring whether or not Naundorff had died as a result of arsenic poisoning. They didn't find levels of arsenic high enough to suggest poisoning. After these tests, Naundorff's humerus was kept in the archives of the Dutch Forensic Laboratory. The hair samples were placed in sealed envelopes and then held in Delft's town archives. Advances in DNA extraction, sequencing, and analysis in the 1980s and 1990s finally made it possible to answer the question: was Karl Wilhelm Naundorff really Louis Charles? Did he truly escape from the temple and survive the revolution? A Dutch historian, Hans Petrie, called geneticist Jean-Jacques Cassiman to suggest DNA testing to explore Naundorff's identity and claims. The humerus and hair from those two archives in the Netherlands provided samples for DNA tests that began in 1993. But we also need to have samples associated with Louis Charles or someone closely related to him so that we can compare everything. At this point, there aren't any potential sources of DNA samples that can be reliably, that's our key word here, reliably attributed to Louis Charles. Locks of his hair had been collected by Marie-Antoinette and supposedly by someone present at the autopsy in the temple, but they weren't included in the genetic studies. It's not clear, at least not to me, where those hair samples have gone if they weren't included in these tests, and if they weren't available to the scientists carrying out the DNA tests. They were used for different tests, comparing them with hairs from Naundorff before this, but those methods that were used were flawed, so the results aren't really considered conclusive. The whole thing sounded like a big mess, but I could try to revisit the hair drama if there's enough interest in that little side quest. For now, let's just stick with the DNA. We also need to know what part of the DNA is being tested, because that will influence where we look for other samples. In the cells of your body, DNA is found in two places: your cell's nucleus, your nuclear DNA, and your mitochondria, your mitochondrial DNA. So yes, they're in the powerhouse of the cell. The Naundorff study used mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondrial DNA is inherited maternally. You get it from your biological mother. So for Louis Charles, the team of scientists needed DNA from Marie-Antoinette and her family. Where did they find samples? A convent. The convent in Klagenfurt, Austria, had a rosary that belonged to Marie-Antoinette's mother, Empress Maria Theresa. This rosary includes medallions containing locks of hair from Maria Theresa's children, and she had several children. From the rosary, the scientists obtained hairs from two of Marie-Antoinette's sisters, Johanna Gabriella and Maria Josepha. More hair samples from Maria Theresa's female descendants came from Belgium. The granddaughter of Marie-Antoinette's sister, Queen Maria Carolina of Naples and the Two Sicilies, was Queen Louise Marie of Belgium. The archives of the Royal Palace in Brussels contributed hair samples from Queen Louise Marie and from her daughter, Empress Charlotte of Mexico. Maria Carolina also had a lot of children, and some of her female line descendants were still living at the time of the study. Queen Anna of Romania donated a blood sample, and her brother, André de Bourbon-Parma, donated a hair sample for this study. That's a pretty good collection of samples from Marie-Antoinette's extended family. But what about samples from Marie-Antoinette herself? Hair samples belonging to her existed as well, preserved in medallions held in a private collection and by a sealed document held in a museum. The sealed document had been decorated with the 3 lilies of the House of Bourbon, and a note written on it by a member of the Bourbon family stated that if the document was still sealed, then it was authentic, and the hair belonged to Marie-Antoinette. So that was a lot of names that I kind of just threw at you all at once in rather quick succession. Let's stop here for a moment and visualize these relationships and, who are these people to one another. And we're going to start with Marie-Antoinette over here. So we have her. And by the time of the Revolution, she had 2 surviving children. Marie Thérèse and Louis Charles. So, what we need from there is essentially what would be, or could be referred to as a most recent common ancestor for the DNA testing. And because we're using mitochondrial DNA, we need a maternal ancestor. So someone who is related to Marie-Antoinette and her children maternally. For that, we're going to go to her mother, Empress Maria Theresa. So we are going to put her up here. Maria Theresa. And then from that rosary with all the medallions, we got hairs from 2 of her other daughters. She had a lot of daughters. So we have 2 of Marie Antoinette's sisters. Johanna Gabriella and Maria Josepha. And then the individuals from Belgium and the living maternal relatives were all descended from yet another sister, Maria Carolina. So we'll add her. Okay, so then, descended from her, we have, through her daughter, Maria Amalia. We have then Maria Amalia's daughter, Louise Marie, and Louise Marie's daughter, Charlotte, Empress of Mexico. And then, so, still sticking with female line, maternal lines, we have several female descendants. Ultimately leading to Anna, Queen of Romania, and her brother, André. So, again, Anna and André were living at the time of the DNA studies and were able to contribute samples. So let's go back through again, and I'm just going to draw little boxes around everyone who we have DNA samples from for this study. We have those hair samples from Marie-Antoinette, Johanna Gabriella, and Maria Josepha from that rosary. We have hair samples from Louise Marie and Charlotte from the Royal Archives in Brussels. And then we have samples donated by Anna and Andre. So, there we have it. This is kind of how we visualize where we're getting all of our samples for the mitochondrial DNA study. So, what did the DNA say about a potential genetic relationship between Naundorf and Marie-Antoinette's family? First, the samples from Queen Louise Marie of Belgium and her daughter, Empress Charlotte of Mexico, had to be excluded. Looking at the hairs under a scanning electron microscope showed that the shafts of the hairs were damaged. The mitochondrial DNA sequences from these hairs didn't match those obtained from Naundorf or Marie-Antoinette's sisters. This could be the result of the hair samples being damaged, it could be from contamination, or the DNA just being too degraded to read. Those are some of the challenges that come with working with ancient DNA. The sequences from Naundorf had 2 nucleotide differences from the sequences from Marie-Antoinette and her sisters, and 4 nucleotide differences when compared to the sequences from Marie-Antoinette's living relatives. Nucleotides are the molecules that are the building blocks of DNA, the 4 bases: adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. I'm sure the Amoeba sisters have videos that explain this in more depth, so please do check out their videos. They are great. Those differences might not sound like a lot, but if Naundorf was Marie-Antoinette's son, we would expect those DNA sequences to match each other. Based on these differences, the scientists concluded that it was unlikely that Carl Wilhelm Naundorf was the son of Marie-Antoinette. After the Naundorf study, another historian made a phone call. He called Jean-Jacques Cassiman, who had led the Naundorf study, and he was like, hey, I know where you can find the remains of Louis Charles. I don't get fun phone calls like that. I get text messages asking if I want to help someone 3D scan a human skull or some teeth. I always want to 3D scan a human skull. The heart that had been preserved for 200 years was removed from the crypt in Saint-Denis for DNA testing on December 15th, 1999. An anatomical report described the heart as having come from a child between the ages of 5 and 12. This is likely just based on the size of the heart. 2 samples were carefully removed from the heart, and each sample was sent to a different lab. Using different labs like this is a way to independently verify the results of DNA testing. This was also done when the first samples from the remains of a Neanderthal were being sequenced and analyzed. It's a way of checking our work. It's a way of saying, hey, did you get the same results? Cool, good. That helps us know that it worked. The 2 labs tasked with testing the heart samples were the Center for Human Genetics in Leuven, Belgium, and the Institute of Forensic Medicine in Münster, Germany. In the lab, the team at the Center for Human Genetics used a gene clean for ancient DNA kit. This isn't super important in terms of the results that they obtained. It's not what I use in the lab. I am simply amused by the name gene clean, and I wanted to share. Both labs sequenced fragments of the heart's mitochondrial DNA and received identical results from their samples. The scientists then compared the heart's mitochondrial DNA sequences to those of Marie-Antoinette and her maternal relatives, the same sequences from the Naundorf study. The sequences were identical, establishing a genetic relationship between the heart and Marie-Antoinette's family. While the evidence from the mitochondrial DNA supports the idea that the heart belonged to Louis Charles, DNA alone cannot prove that the heart belonged to a child of Marie-Antoinette and Louis XVI, instead of some other maternal relative of Marie-Antoinette and her family, the Habsburgs. The scientists did use statistical analysis with likelihood ratios to explore the probability of the heart belonging to a relative of the Habsburgs and the probability that it belonged to a random, unrelated individual. The heart is 166 times more likely to belong to a member of the Habsburg family than to a random, unrelated individual. Could the heart have actually belonged to Marie Antoinette's older son, Louis Joseph? It's unlikely. Louis Joseph had been buried in Saint-Denis, but his heart, which had been removed from the rest of his remains, was lost after the French Revolution. Saint-Denis had been vandalized during the Revolution. It was a big mess. While his remains were being prepared for burial, Louis Joseph's heart was embalmed. This meant it had been cut open and filled with herbs and embalming liquid. The child's heart used in the DNA studies showed no evidence for the embalming process, so it's unlikely to have belonged to Louis Joseph. We also have the historical record to fill in the gaps about the heart's identity. The only maternal relative of Marie Antoinette and her family who died in the temple and was autopsied by Dr. Peloton would have to be Louis Charles. This whole story couldn't have been written the same way if Dr. Peloton hadn't preserved that heart and given it to the Archbishop of Paris with a written document explaining what it was. Putting all of this evidence together led to an acceptance of the heart being the remains of Louis Charles, Louis XVII of France. In 2004, it was reburied in the crypt of Saint-Denis, the resting place of France's kings. Where can you read more? I'll have all of my sources listed in the video's description, but if you want to read about this story in more detail, I highly recommend The Lost King of France by Deborah Cadbury. This really helped me with the historical context necessary for writing the script, though please be advised that it does go into more detail about the mistreatment of Louis Charles while he was imprisoned, as well as just the general violence of the French Revolution. Let me know what other stories about historical figures and DNA analysis you would like to see. We're not done with Marie-Antoinette's family yet, for some reason, but thank you for watching. So we have a lot of queens on our chart here, and some empresses too. Marie-Antoinette, Queen of France; Maria Theresa, Empress of the Holy Roman Empire; Maria Carolina, so one of Marie-Antoinette's sisters, was Queen of Naples and the Two Sicilies; Louise Marie, Queen of Belgium; and Charlotte, Empress of Mexico; and Anna, Queen of Romania. But I also have two bonus queens on our chart here for you. First, Maria Amalia. She was actually the last Queen of France. So I think after Napoleon's second exile, they brought in the monarchy again. It just kind of goes back and forth for a long time in French history. It's really confusing. But she's actually our last Queen of France. But before she became Queen of France, Marie-Antoinette's daughter, Marie-Thérèse, was also Queen of France. So again, she is the only one of Marie-Antoinette's children to survive the French Revolution and leave prison. So she goes to live her life after the revolution, kind of moving around Europe, all of these things. But she eventually becomes Queen of France for about 20 minutes. This is because she married one of her French cousins, related on her father's side of the family, and then eventually the descent kind of went to him. Then he abdicated super quick, so hence the 20 minutes. We can talk about this more later in another DNA study video. Like I mentioned, we're not done with Marie-Antoinette and her family yet, so let me know if you are interested in that. But yeah, some bonus content and bonus queens for you.
DNA tests that began in 1993. What happened to my script? I have my script on a teleprompter in front of me. That's what I'm actually looking at. And I think I spliced some sentences together in a really messy way. So now we're backtracking to fix that. I did not realize just how dark this black curtain would be as my background. So I didn't know that it would look like I'm filming just in the void. I'm also recording the audio on my phone, and it is generating titles for each little clip based on what it thinks I'm saying. Peloton, the doctor, is coming out as Peloton, the bikes, the exercise thing, and every time I see it, it just makes me chuckle.